The flood came without warning, swollen by weeks of unseen rain upriver. By the time the water reached the floodplains of Vicksburg, the river had changed its path like an animal deciding on a new lair. When it receded, the land was left cut open, raw, reshaped, and littered with what the current had chosen not to carry away. Amid the mud and toppled trees, there stood the warped remains of St. Augustine's Chapel, a once white wooden church now tilted at an uneasy angle, its foundation half buried under a heavy skin of river silt. The air around it was still damp and clung to the lungs, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the warped rafters. To the townsfolk, the church had been abandoned for years, its congregation scattered after the priest's sudden departure. They had no reason to expect anything inside except decay. When county officials pried open the doors, the hinges groaned in protest, as though the building itself resisted their entry. Light spilled into a space that should have been lifeless but instead carried a stifling heat, the kind that does not belong to an empty place. The pews were not simply overturned by the flood. They had been stacked in deliberate formation, blocking the altar as though to keep something from reaching it. The hymnals, swollen with water damage, lay unopened in neat piles, too precise for the chaos of rushing water. And there was the smell. Not the mildew of soaked wood, but something sharper, heavier, and intimate. It clung to the back of the throat, the unmistakable weight of rot. Near the altar, the warped floorboards seemed uneven, the grain of the wood disrupted by something beneath. A deputy tapped his boot against them, and the hollow thud did not match the solid foundation of the rest of the church. The boards had been sealed with nails so old that their heads had rusted into the wood itself, yet they were set in perfect, careful lines. As the men began to work them loose, the smell intensified, pushing one of them to step back and cover his mouth. The last board came free with a sound like a gasp, and there beneath them was a trapdoor made of thick oak, its edges lined with tar and salt, as if someone had wanted more than just a lock to keep it closed. When the seal was broken, a rush of air escaped, stale, warm, and full of the memory of death. It was not the faint, faded scent of old bones, but the active, invasive odor of bodies kept from the cleansing of the earth. Lantern light revealed a narrow wooden ladder descending into darkness. The air felt heavier with each step down, the walls close enough to scrape knuckles against. At the bottom lay a space just large enough to stand in, but the floor beneath the silt was uneven. A boot scuffed against something solid, and the shape it uncovered was pale and round. A skull, the jaw twisted as though caught mid-breath. The silt had preserved more than bone. There were fragments of cloth clinging to skeletal frames, the occasional glint of a rosary bead, a rusted button still fastened to nothing. The bodies were not scattered. They had been arranged in a pattern, a perfect ring pressed into the floor, each head turned inward, each hand folded neatly over the chest as if prepared for burial rites that no church would ever claim. The center of the circle was empty, a space intentionally left untouched. Above them, the warped ceiling of the church groaned under its own weight, and the river whispered just beyond its walls, as if the water itself was keeping the secret until someone was brave, or foolish, enough to disturb it. It was clear to those present that this was no mass grave born of accident or disaster. The precision, the preparation, the sealed door, and the salted edges spoke of ritual, of someone who had taken great care to keep these bodies together and hidden. In that silence, standing among the first hints of something much darker, the officials realized the flood had not uncovered a ruin. It had exposed an intention, one that had been waiting undisturbed for years. The emptiness at the center of that circle would demand answers, but the answers would not come easily. Something had been placed there once, or perhaps something had been meant to rise from it. And whatever had begun in the depths of St. Augustine's chapel had not ended with the river. Under the dim flicker of lantern light, the officials pulled themselves out of the pit, their boots heavy with silt, their breath uneven from more than the foul air below. Outside, the late afternoon sun was muted behind a haze that still hung low over the floodplain, turning everything a sickly yellow. The church's warped doorway framed the world beyond like the threshold to another life, but those who had been inside knew they would carry the darkness of that pit with them long after they stepped into open air. They said nothing to the gathering onlookers, only exchanged quiet, deliberate glances as though speaking the truth aloud might give it the chance to spread. The sheriff ordered the place sealed, posting 2 men at the door through the night. They would not sleep. The odor alone was enough to keep anyone awake, a constant reminder that the dead were only a few steps below. The air seemed to cling to them, seeping into skin and clothing until they could taste it on their tongues. Even the wind avoided that building. It passed over and around as though it too knew not to disturb what was beneath. And though the discovery had been made in daylight, every sound inside the church, the creak of wood, the settling of the walls, carried the weight of night. By morning, word had spread farther than the sheriff would have liked. Farmers from the far edges of the floodplain came to stand in the mud and stare, their faces pale, their eyes restless. Some crossed themselves as they looked at the leaning steeple. Others simply shook their heads and walked away without asking questions. No one demanded to see the bodies. In this place, curiosity had its limits. Those who stayed long enough to speak told stories of nights years ago when the church had been lit well past midnight, the windows glowing with a faint orange light as if a fire burned low inside. They remembered hearing faint chanting carried on the wind, though the words were never clear. Back then, no one questioned it. St. Augustine's had always been the kind of place where people left things unspoken. Inside, the arrangement of the bodies was studied in silence. A man from the coroner's office knelt at the edge of the ring, tracing the position of one skeletal hand without touching it. The alignment was too precise to be chance. The heads angled the same way, the spacing exact. Even the tilt of their folded hands mirrored from one to the next. It was not burial. It was presentation. At the empty center, the floorboards bore faint grooves, as though something heavy had once rested there and had been dragged away before the room was sealed. There was no sign of flooding below the trapdoor, no indication that the river had ever touched this place. The bodies had been preserved in their own air, their own darkness left to wait. The sheriff pressed for answers in the county records, but the paper trail thinned too quickly. The church had been operating outside normal oversight for years before its closure. Financial records ended abruptly. The last note in the parish ledger simply read, "All debts settled." The name of the last presiding priest was nowhere to be found, his tenure marked only by initials and the faded impression of a ring in the corner of certain pages. The same ring shape now faintly burned into the wood at the altar, half hidden beneath dust. That night when the watchmen took their posts again, they swore they heard movement from inside. Not the shifting of the building, not the sound of rodents, but the soft scrape of something brushing against wood, slow and deliberate. One man pressed his ear to the wall and felt a vibration, as if the air beneath the trapdoor was moving again. He told no one until morning, but by then the others had heard it too. And none of them would admit how close they had come to unsealing the pit again, just to be sure it was still only the dead inside. By the third day, the river had already begun to reclaim the edges of the floodplain, creeping back toward the church with a patient, inevitable pull. The sheriff knew they had little time before the water would make further work impossible. A team was sent in with orders to recover the remains, catalog them, and store them until the state could take over the investigation. But even before they descended into the pit, the air in the church seemed different, heavier, wetter, carrying a faint vibration that no one could place. The smell had deepened, no longer just the stench of death, but something sharper, metallic, almost medicinal, as if the decay was laced with intent. One by one, the bodies were lifted from the ring, each tagged and carried up the ladder in silence. No one spoke as they worked. It felt wrong to break the hush that pressed in from all sides. They noticed things as they went. Identical ligature marks at the wrists and ankles, faint circular scars along the ribs, some bones wrapped in what looked like strips of aged linen sealed with a black resin that cracked under touch. The skulls were the worst. Many bore clean, deliberate openings at the back, not jagged breaks from violence, but careful, practiced incisions. The kind only a steady hand could make. When they reached the last body, something about it froze the men in place. It was smaller than the others, the bones more delicate, the skull untouched. Around its wrists and ankles were no marks, and instead of being folded neatly, its arms were crossed tightly over the chest, as if in self-protection. The fabric clinging to its frame was different too. Not the worn, simple cloth of the others, but a thin white shift, still faintly intact, stained only around the collar with something dark and long dried. At the base of its spine, a small wooden disc had been affixed with resin. The same ring pattern burned into its surface as the one at the altar upstairs. When this final body was brought into the open air, the watchers outside drew back without knowing why. A heaviness seemed to cling to it, an unease that passed from one person to the next without words. The sheriff ordered it covered at once and taken to the far end of the holding tent, away from the others. But that night, one of the deputies assigned to guard the remains swore that he saw the sheet shift, as though a draft had caught it. Only there was no wind in the tent. And when he lifted the edge to check, the body lay exactly as before, yet its head seemed ever so slightly turned toward him. By morning, 2 more deputies refused to go near the holding area. They spoke of a faint sound, not the scrape of movement as before, but something softer, almost like breathing, measured and slow, coming from somewhere among the covered shapes. The sheriff dismissed it as nerves and fatigue, but he could not dismiss the way the air felt colder in that corner of the tent, or the way even the lantern light seemed to dim when it swayed too near. The river was rising faster now. Soon it would press against the church's rotting walls again. And there was a growing fear among the men that the water was not the only thing returning. On the fourth night, the river's edge had swallowed the lower paths, curling closer to the church like a predator circling its kill. The water moved with a sluggish determination, carrying with it branches, debris, and the occasional shape that looked too human to be a log. The holding tent stood farther up the bank, its canvas walls rattling in the restless wind. But inside, the air was stagnant, weighted with the lingering scent of the exhumed dead. The bodies lay on their stretchers in orderly rows, each covered, each tagged, each waiting for the slow machinery of the state to decide their fate. Yet the deputies could not shake the sense that the arrangement in the tent felt wrong, as though the bodies themselves were uneasy at being separated from the ring below the church. That night, the youngest deputy on watch heard the sound again. Not breathing this time, but a faint rhythmic tapping, as if fingernails brushed wood in a measured pattern. It came from the far end of the tent where the final, smaller body rested. He tried to ignore it, but the sound was deliberate, like a metronome keeping time for something only it could hear. When he lifted the lantern and stepped closer, the tapping stopped. The sheet was undisturbed, yet the faint smell of salt and resin seemed stronger here, cutting through the odor of decay. He left quickly, telling himself he'd imagined it. By morning, the sheriff decided the remains would be moved into the town's old granary for safekeeping until officials arrived. The work was slow and tense. When the last body, the small one with the unmarked skull, was lifted, the wooden disc at its spine came loose, clattering to the ground. One of the laborers picked it up without thinking, turning it over in his palm. The ring symbol was deeper than it had appeared before, carved not just into the surface but through to the other side, forming a perfect hole at its center. Inside that hole was something pale and grainy pressed tightly together. It looked like packed earth, but when the man tapped it out into his hand, it dissolved into a fine, light powder that clung to his skin. That night he would be the first to wake screaming. His cot soaked with sweat, his voice raw from shouting words in a language no one recognized. By dawn he could no longer speak at all. He sat rigid in his chair, staring at the horizon where the church stood leaning over the slow advancing water. Others began to avoid him, yet none dared to ask what he had seen. The sheriff said nothing publicly, but his urgency to finish the work sharpened. The river was nearly at the church's threshold, and the ground beneath the building had grown soft. By the week's end, they would learn too late that the river was not reclaiming the church to erase a crime. It was sealing something back into the earth, something that had not been meant to be disturbed. The circle had been broken. The emptiness at its center had been carried away. And in the quiet spaces between the rising water and the wind, some swore they could hear the faint hum of a low, tuneless melody drifting up from the flooded pit. The sheriff stood at the river bank on the morning the water finally touched the church's threshold. The steeple's reflection wavered on the surface, bending and breaking as ripples spread outward, as though the building itself was breathing beneath. The current. The air was unnaturally still, save for the low, constant gurgle of the river swallowing the lower steps. Behind him, the townsfolk kept their distance, their voices low, their eyes fixed anywhere but on the leaning structure. By now, the stories had spread faster than the water. Whispers of the body's strange arrangement, the marks, the wooden disc, and the man who no longer spoke. No one wanted to be close enough to confirm them. Inside the granary, the remains lay in their new confinement. The deputies had stopped using lanterns there, claiming the shadows stretched too far when the light flickered, curling over the walls like grasping fingers. The small body had been placed apart from the others, its covering pinned down as though to keep it from moving. Yet the men who passed closest swore they could hear that faint, tuneless hum again, rising and falling with an almost human rhythm. They avoided the corner entirely, unwilling to test whether the sound grew louder when approached. That night, a storm rose without warning, driving sheets of rain across the floodplain and pushing the river higher in hours than it had climbed in days. By morning, the church's lower walls were gone, claimed by the current, and the pit beneath the altar was drowned in brown, swirling water. The ladder they had used was nowhere to be seen. Whatever had been left in the silt was now deep under the surface, hidden again. But the men who had stood in that chamber knew the water had not erased the pattern in which the bodies had lain. It was still there, preserved in the soft earth, waiting. The sheriff considered the work finished. The state officials would arrive soon, take their notes, and leave with what was left of the dead. But for those who had been inside, there was no closing the matter. The empty space at the center of the ring had not been an accident. It had been prepared, and now that space was no longer empty, it had been filled, carried away from the church, placed somewhere it was never meant to be. 2 days later, a farmer's child was found standing in the shallows near the edge of town at dawn. The boy was dry from head to toe, his clothes unstained by mud. He stared straight ahead and hummed a slow, tuneless melody that no one recognized, but everyone felt they had heard before. When asked where he had been, he only turned his head toward the river and kept humming. The deputies did not touch him. They stepped back, looking to the sheriff for orders, but he had nothing to give. The water was still rising, the current pulling stronger, and somewhere beneath its surface the church waited in silence. By the following week, the river had swallowed the last of St. Augustine's chapel. Only the very tip of the steeple remained above water, jutting from the current like the final breath of a drowning man. From a distance it looked almost peaceful, but those who had been inside knew the truth. The calm was a lie. The pit beneath the altar was now part of the riverbed, hidden beneath layers of swirling silt and dark water. No one could see the ring anymore, but they could feel it, as if the pattern had sunk into the land itself, pressing upward through the soles of their boots. The granary became the town's quiet wound. People avoided passing too close to it, even when they had business nearby. Inside, the bodies lay cold and still, their tags curling at the edges from damp air. Yet the deputies swore the rows never looked quite the same from one day to the next. A shift in the angle of a skull, a hand resting where it hadn't before, a covering slightly out of place. The smallest body, still kept apart from the rest, had become the focus of a fear no one would name. The faint hum returned more often now, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes in the gray light of morning, drifting through the granary walls like the echo of a tune heard underwater. When the state officials finally arrived, they moved through their work briskly, cataloging each body without asking questions about the circumstances of their discovery. The sheriff noticed how they avoided looking at the small body for too long, their gloved hands careful not to brush against it. The wooden disc had been sealed in a tin box, but even closed, it seemed to draw the eye as though it wanted to be noticed. One of the officials, a man pale and tense, muttered something about repeating configurations and intact sequence before catching himself and going silent. That night, after the wagons carried the dead away, the granary felt lighter but not empty. The deputies reported hearing water dripping inside, though there were no leaks. Some swore they saw ripples spreading across the dusty floor as if it were a pond, vanishing before they could be touched. The sheriff stayed long after the others left, standing in the quiet until the faint hum began again, low and steady, coming not from the empty space but from somewhere far deeper, as though the river itself had learned the tune. By dawn, the steeple was gone. The river had swallowed every trace of the church, and though the town tried to move on, they could not forget the circle in the earth, the empty space at its center, and the fact that it was no longer where it belonged. Somewhere out there it had been carried into the world, and if the hum was truly in the water now, then it was already moving downstream. Spring came late that year, and with it the thaw swelled the river into something restless and wide. Bargemen traveling south began to tell quiet stories when they stopped for supplies in Vicksburg, not about the flood itself, but about strange things in the current. A child's voice humming from somewhere unseen, ripples moving against the flow, shadows beneath the water that seemed to follow the boats for miles before slipping away. Most wrote it off as river talk, the kind of tales men swap when the night is long. But a few swore the stories had the same tune, the same slow, wandering melody no one could name. The sheriff tried to bury the memory of Saint Augustine's along with the dead, but the town had changed. People crossed the street to avoid certain places. Children were called inside before dusk, and no one lingered near the river after nightfall. The granary stood locked and empty, yet those who lived closest claimed they still heard the hum on certain nights, carried faint on the wind. The sound was never loud, but it worked its way under the skin into the skull like something meant not to be heard with the ears, but to be felt. In late May, a body surfaced 20 miles downriver. Not bloated, not broken by the current, but pale and rigid, its limbs drawn tight against its chest. The skin was unmarked except for a faint ring-shaped burn at the base of the spine. The coroner who examined it was not from Vicksburg and did not know the story. Yet he left town the next morning without collecting his pay. The body vanished from the county records entirely. By summer, the sheriff had grown old in months. His hands shook when he wrote, his hair gone to the color of river silt. One evening, standing on the bluff, he saw something floating far out in the current. A small, pale figure drifting without moving, turning slowly as the water carried it. It faced the town as it passed, and though the distance was great, he swore he saw its lips move. The hum rose faintly on the wind, then it was gone, taken south, swallowed by the bend in the river, heading for waters the sheriff would never see. In the years that followed, the river changed course again, leaving a shallow oxbow lake where St. Augustine's had once stood. Fishermen avoided it. They said no fish ever bit there, though sometimes lines would go taut as if something deep below had taken hold, pulling slowly until the hook snapped. And always, on still mornings when the mist sat low on the water, the lake would seem to breathe. Slow, deep, and in time with a melody that had no beginning and no end. Decades passed, but the lake where St. Augustine's once stood never lost its reputation. The trees along its banks grew twisted, their roots gripping the mud like clutching hands, and the water stayed dark even in the height of summer. Locals taught their children to keep away, though no one could fully explain why without speaking of the church, the bodies, and the circle beneath the altar. The memory of the flood had faded into history books, but the details of what was found remained in whispers. Not because people forgot, but because they knew remembering too clearly might draw something back. By the turn of the century, the town had changed, its dirt roads replaced by brick and the floodplain bordered by levees. Outsiders came through more often. Surveyors, fishermen, and the occasional curious traveler who had heard the old story in fragments. Some of them walked down to the lake out of stubborn disbelief, laughing at the locals' warnings. A few returned pale and quiet, refusing to speak of what they'd seen. Others never came back at all, their names becoming part of the growing list of those who had moved on but left their belongings behind. One summer, a research team from the state university arrived to study sediment patterns. They brought modern instruments, spoke of mapping the lake bed, and dismissed the tales of odd currents and strange sounds. But when their lead diver resurfaced after the first descent, he refused to go back under. His face was gray, his eyes wide, and he mumbled about arrangements and waiting places before locking himself in their truck. The rest of the team packed their equipment that night and left without filing a report. Years later, children still spoke of hearing the hum when the wind shifted just right. A low, wandering melody that seemed to come from the center of the lake, though no one could see anything there. Elders claimed it carried farther on damp nights, curling into open windows and settling in the ears of anyone foolish enough to listen too long. Some swore that if you hummed it back, the water would ripple as if answering. None admitted to trying. The land remembers, the river remembers. And beneath that lake the circle remains, its center long since disturbed, its purpose unfinished. Whatever was carried away the day the church's trapdoor was opened has had decades to drift through the veins of the water, slipping quietly into places where no one is looking. And if the hum can still be heard, it means the circle is not just waiting, it is calling. By the winter of 1911, the lake had frozen over for the first time in living memory. The townsfolk took it as a sign of a harsh season ahead, but those who remembered the old story said the freeze was wrong, too sudden, too complete. No thin ice forming in rings, no gradual thickening. One morning it had simply appeared, a solid sheet from bank to bank, as if something beneath had exhaled and locked the surface in place. The children wanted to play on it, to test its strength, but the elders forbade it. They claimed the ice wasn't holding the water in. It was holding something else down. For weeks the lake lay silent beneath its pale shell, the dark trees around it bare and brittle. Then came the thaw, faster than it should have been, the ice breaking in great jagged sheets that clattered against each other as the wind drove them to shore. Those who lived nearby said they heard the hum again during the melt, muffled at first, then rising in clarity until it seemed to roll out over the town itself. No one went to see. They kept their doors shut, their curtains drawn, pretending the sound was only in their heads. That spring, 2 hunters followed deer tracks through the floodplain and came upon something lodged in the reeds at the far end of the lake. It was small, pale and curled tightly as if trying to keep warm. At first they thought it was the body of a child, but when they turned it over they saw no face, only smooth, unbroken skin where features should have been. At the base of the spine was the faint outline of a ring, burned into the flesh, the edges still dark as if freshly marked. They dropped it and fled without speaking, but by the next day the thing was gone, carried off by the water or something in it. Word of the hunters' discovery spread, and soon people began to notice other changes. Livestock refusing to drink from certain troughs, dogs whining at the sound of running water, a wet footprint found on a second-story window ledge, and always the hum, not constant but frequent enough to remind the town it had not been forgotten. The sheriff's grandson, now a grown man, would sometimes stand at the bluff where his grandfather once watched the river. He'd listen to the water moving below and wonder if it was still carrying something with it, something that had no need for time, something that had waited decades already. And on certain nights, when the moon was thin and the wind still, he swore the hum was not coming from the lake at all anymore, but from somewhere far inland, as if the circle's center had found new ground. By the summer of 1924, the hum had spread beyond the lake. Farmers in the outlying fields swore they heard it in the irrigation ditches at night, a low, pulsing tone that made the water shiver even when the wind was still. Cattle would stand frozen at the trough, heads bent low as though listening for something only they understood. A few older townsfolk recognized the melody immediately, but none dared to say so aloud. It was the same slow, tuneless rise and fall that had drifted out of St. Augustine's pit more than 80 years earlier. In July, a girl named Ruth Layton went missing from her family's farm. Her father swore she had been in the kitchen at dusk, shelling peas, when he stepped outside to fetch wood. He returned minutes later to find the back door open, the bowl of peas spilled across the floor and a trail of wet footprints leading to the edge of their small pond. The water was calm. Her shoes were still by the door. The search parties found no sign of her. Not in the woods, not along the river, not in the lake. But on the second night of searching, men in the western fields claimed they heard a faint hum drifting over the rows of corn, moving east toward town. A week later, in the middle of the night, the church bell rang. No one could explain it. St. Augustine's had been gone for decades, its steeple swallowed by the river, yet the sound carried clearly over the rooftops. It was not the bright metallic peal of a bell in use, but a warped, uneven toll, as if pulled from deep underwater. The hum followed seconds later, soft and steady, lingering long enough for everyone awake to hear it. The sheriff's grandson, now a man of 40, felt his chest tighten at the sound. He had never heard the bell in his lifetime, yet he knew exactly what it meant. The circle was no longer waiting in the lake. In the days that followed, the town began to see shapes moving in the periphery. Small, pale figures glimpsed just at the edge of lantern light, always gone when approached. Footprints appeared in places they should not have, pressed into dry dirt in perfect circles. On one fog-heavy morning, the outline of that old burned ring appeared on the side of a barn, dark and damp against the wood, with no sign of how it had been made. By nightfall, it was gone. It was then the old ones started locking their doors before sunset, not against thieves or storms, but against something they refused to name. The hum could be heard more often now, threading through the quiet hours like a promise. Those who knew the story understood. The thing carried from the church's pit, the thing that had once filled the empty center of the ring, had taken root. And whatever it was waiting for in 1843, it was still waiting now. Only now, it was closer. By the winter of 1925, the hum was no longer something the town could pretend not to hear. It wove itself into daily life, faint in the mornings, stronger at dusk, and almost unbearable on windless nights when the air sat heavy and still. People began to speak in lowered voices, their words clipped as though afraid to draw the attention of whatever had brought the sound inland. Shops closed earlier. Families stopped gathering on porches after supper. And yet, despite the fear, no one left town. It was as if some quiet pressure held them in place, the way the river holds silt in its bend. The first real sign of change came in February, when the snow began to melt but the ground refused to thaw. Patches of earth around certain wells and ponds stayed hard as stone, the frost lines unbroken even under direct sunlight. In these frozen patches, faint depressions could be seen. Shallow grooves that, when traced together, formed the same perfect circle the deputies had seen beneath the church 8 decades before. At the center of each was a single bare footprint, small and sharply defined, as if pressed there moments earlier. Then came the disappearances, not all at once, but slow, deliberate, weeks apart. A mill worker walking home along the canal, a boy cutting across the fields after feeding the horses, an elderly woman stepping out to fetch rainwater. None of them screamed. None left signs of struggle. In each case, the last person to see them swore they looked calm, almost entranced, moving toward the nearest source of water. The search parties followed the trails to the edge of ponds, irrigation ditches, or the lake, and always found the same thing. Still water, undisturbed except for a faint ripple that widened, then faded, leaving the surface smooth. One night in March, the hum stopped. The silence was worse. People lay awake, straining to hear it, as though the absence of sound meant something had ended, or something had begun. Just before dawn, the sheriff's grandson woke to the smell of salt and resin in his room. At the foot of his bed stood a small, pale figure in a thin white shift, its head bowed, its arms crossed tightly over its chest. It did not move, but in the dim light he saw the faint mark of a ring burned into the base of its spine. When he blinked, it was gone. The air was still, the smell fading. But from somewhere outside, far away yet impossibly close, the hum began again. This time it did not drift or wander. It carried with purpose, like a summons finally being answered. And he knew then, with a certainty that made his blood run cold, that the circle had found its place again. Somewhere in the dark, It was whole. By early spring of 1926, the town had stopped trying to resist. It wasn't surrender in the usual sense. No one openly declared defeat. But there was a shared understanding that whatever had taken root here could not be driven out. People no longer searched for the missing. Doors stayed locked not out of hope for safety but out of ritual, as though the act itself was the only thing left between them and inevitability. The hum was now constant, so faint in the daylight it could be mistaken for the wind. But at night it deepened, sinking into the walls, the floors, the bones. Those who tried to leave found reasons to turn back before they reached the edge of town, often without remembering why. By April, the lake was no longer the only place avoided. Wells, cisterns, even shallow streams began to draw unease. Animals refused to drink without coaxing, and when they did, they often fell ill. The ground around these water sources grew slick and dark, not from rain, but from seepage rising up from below, smelling faintly of the same salt and resin found beneath St. Augustine's. Children who played near them sometimes returned with wet footprints on their clothes, too small to be their own, though they swore no one else had been there. It was then the sheriff's grandson began keeping notes just as his grandfather had done. He documented the footprints, the marks burned into door frames, the nights when the hum grew so loud the walls seemed to vibrate. But there was one pattern he kept to himself. Each new mark or disappearance was spaced in a way that formed a ring on his map of the town. A perfect circle growing slowly outward from the lake, with its center fixed on the place where the church had once stood. One night in late May, the hum stopped again. The air grew cold, heavy, and still. People stayed in their beds, waiting, holding their breath. Just after midnight, every dog in town began to bark at once. Short, frantic bursts that ended in silence as sudden as it began. Then came the sound of water, not rushing but rising as though the river itself was lifting into the air. Those who dared to look out their windows swore they saw thin streams of water threading through the streets, moving with purpose, flowing toward a single unseen point. By dawn, the water was gone, leaving no puddles, no mud, no sign it had ever been there. But in the center of town, where the main road widened, the dirt was pressed into the unmistakable shape of a ring, so large it touched the walls of the buildings on either side. At its center, the ground was smooth and undisturbed, save for a single small wooden disc lying flat in the dust. The mark of the burned ring was carved deep into it, and within its hollow center sat a pinch of pale, clinging powder. No one touched it. By nightfall, it had sunk halfway into the earth on its own, as though being pulled from below. The hum returned that same evening, fuller, stronger, carrying not just over the town, but into it, through it. And though no one said the words aloud, they all understood. The circle was no longer searching. It had been completed. By midsummer of 1926, the hum had changed. It was no longer the wandering, aimless melody the old ones remembered from their youth. It now carried structure, a slow, deliberate rhythm that felt like the turning of a great wheel. People swore they could feel it in the soles of their feet, a faint pulse through the ground that matched the sound. The air in town had grown dense and warm, heavy even at night, and the smell of salt and resin lingered constantly, coating the back of the throat. The disappearances continued, but no one called them that anymore. The missing were not taken from their homes in the dead of night. Instead, they began to leave in the open, a merchant closing his shop in the middle of the day and walking toward the edge of town, a seamstress setting down her work and stepping into the street without a word, a group of school children filing silently out of the schoolhouse and toward the lake. No one stopped them. Those who tried found their own legs moving in the same direction, the hum filling their ears until they could think of nothing else. The sheriff's grandson watched from his window one evening as 3 people walked past in single file, their heads bowed, their arms crossed tightly over their chests. The last in line was a girl no older than 12. She turned her head slightly as she passed, and he saw her eyes, pale, glassy, and utterly without recognition. At the base of her neck, just above the collar of her dress, was the faint outline of a ring burned into her skin. By the end of August, the lake had swelled beyond its banks without a drop of rain. The water was black in the moonlight, too still for the summer wind, as though it were a single solid surface. That night the hum reached its loudest pitch yet, not chaotic but focused, like a signal answering some long-awaited reply. From every direction people began to walk toward the water. Those who resisted felt it in their chests, a pull deeper than fear or reason. Windows were thrown open, doors left swinging, and the streets filled with silent, moving bodies. The sheriff's grandson forced himself to watch from the bluff, clutching his grandfather's old revolver, though he knew it would make no difference. Below, the townspeople reached the shore and stepped into the water without hesitation. The surface rippled around them, but none splashed, none sank. They simply kept walking, their heads lifting slowly as they moved deeper, the hum rising in answer. In the moonlight, the surface of the lake shivered, and beneath it, just visible for a moment, was the shape of a perfect ring, glowing faintly, its center no longer empty. By morning, the lake was still again. The streets were empty. And in the silence that followed, the sheriff's grandson finally understood the truth. The thing they had carried from the pit in 1843 had not been a person, but a key. And the circle had never been meant to wait forever. Autumn of 1926 settled over the floodplain with a strange, stagnant quiet. The town was not empty, not entirely. But those who remained were changed. They moved slowly as if underwater, their eyes dull, their speech reduced to the barest words. At night, some could be seen standing in doorways or in the middle of the street, facing the lake as if listening for instructions. The hum was no longer constant. It came in deep, resonant waves like a heartbeat echoing through the ground. Each time it sounded, the still figures would straighten, their heads tilting toward the source before returning to whatever they had been doing. The sheriff's grandson kept to the upper floors of his house, watching from the windows. He'd drawn crude maps on the walls, marking each home and each person still inside it. Every few days, another mark disappeared, replaced by a single ring drawn in black ink. He could see the pattern forming again. The same perfect circle the deputies had found beneath St. Augustine's. Only now it was made not from the dead, but from the living, spread across the streets and fields, their positions aligning with unnerving precision. On a cold October morning, a dense fog rolled in from the lake, so thick it smothered sound and sight. The grandson listened from his room, straining to hear the faint hum through the white silence. Instead, he heard footsteps, dozens, maybe hundreds, moving in slow unison toward the water. He opened the window just enough to glimpse them through the fog. Men, women, and children, all with arms crossed tightly over their chests, walking without pause. Their feet left no impressions in the damp earth. He followed from a distance, his boots sinking into the soft ground, but the fog swallowed them too quickly. By the time he reached the shore, the water was smooth, the last ripple fading into the center of the lake. The fog began to lift, revealing the banks empty once more. On the wet ground where they had walked lay small, pale, wooden discs, dozens of them, each carved with the same burned ring, each containing a pinch of fine, clinging powder. The sight pulled at something deep in his memory, something his grandfather had said only once. If the center is filled, the circle breathes again. That night the hum returned deeper than ever before, carrying through the bones of the houses, through the soil, through the lake bed itself. It no longer sounded like a summons, it sounded like a voice. Patient, assured, and terribly certain that nothing could stop what had already begun. Winter came early in 1927, the first snow falling before the harvest was done. The cold did nothing to still the lake. Even as ice formed on its edges, the center remained open, black and smooth, pulsing faintly with the rhythm of the hum. Those who had once gone missing never returned, but their absence no longer felt like loss. It felt like the town itself had been hollowed out, thinned to make room for something else. The remaining few lived in a strange half-life, going about their days with slow, mechanical purpose, their eyes always drifting toward the water. The sheriff's grandson rarely slept now. At night he heard the hum shift, breaking into intervals as though carrying some kind of pattern. A code, a language. When he pressed his ear to the floor, the vibration was stronger. The sound was not only in the air, it was moving through the ground, into the foundations of the houses, threading through the very timbers. He began to notice faint marks appearing on the walls and floors, concentric circles pressed into the wood as if from enormous weight, though there had been no footsteps, no furniture moved. In mid-January, a storm tore through the floodplain, flooding the roads and forcing the remaining townsfolk to higher ground. From the bluff, the grandson saw the water rise around the lake until the distinction between shore and river was gone. And yet the black center of the lake never swelled, never overflowed. It seemed to hold steady, as though the water around it bent to its shape. That night he dreamt of the church, not as it had been in ruin, but whole, glowing faintly from within, the trapdoor open and the pit below filled with water. At the center of the ring stood the small, pale figure in the white shift, its arms crossed, its head tilted upward. When it opened its eyes, he felt the hum in his chest, the rhythm of his own heart sinking to it until he couldn't tell where his pulse ended and the sound began. He woke at dawn to find wet footprints on the stairs leading down to the front door. Outside, the snow was untouched except for a single perfect ring pressed into the frozen ground just beyond his porch. In its center was one of the pale wooden discs, the burned ring carved so deep it seemed to cut right through. Inside its hollow was no powder this time, but a small fragment of bone still slick with something warm. By then he understood the truth his grandfather had tried to keep buried. The circle was not only whole again, it was feeding. and once it was strong enough, it would not be bound to the lake or to the town, or even to the river that had once hidden it. It would move, and when it did, there would be no reason for it to stop. By the spring of 1927, the change was no longer confined to the town. Small farming settlements miles away began reporting odd disturbances. Animals found dead in perfect spirals in their pens, wells producing water that tasted faintly of brine, strange hums in the night that made the air seem thick and metallic. The sheriff's grandson recognized these as signs of the circle widening. The lake was no longer its anchor, it was only the place it had first rooted after being freed. Now it was reaching outward, laying claim to new ground. One afternoon in April, a traveling peddler arrived from downriver with goods to sell. Over whiskey in the tavern, he mentioned something that made the grandson's blood run cold. A group of strangers seen walking into the Yazoo River at dusk 2 towns over. They didn't thrash or sink, just vanished beneath the surface as though the water opened for them. The peddler swore he heard a low, droning sound as it happened, the kind that settles in your chest instead of your ears. When he hummed a few notes to imitate it, every head in the tavern went still. It was the same tune. The grandson knew then that the circle was no longer a single formation in one place. It was multiplying, repeating itself like a disease carried by the river's veins. And whatever force commanded it had learned to move unseen, to send its influence through any water deep enough to hide its voice. By early May, the strange footprints began appearing in his own home again. Always wet, always too small. They would lead to the door and vanish outside, but on one occasion they led to the mirror in his bedroom. The glass was fogged, though the room was warm, and when he wiped it clean, a faint ring mark was visible on the surface, as if burned into the silver backing. It stayed for days before fading, but in the nights that followed, he dreamed of standing at the lake's center, surrounded by figures in white shifts, their arms crossed, their heads bowed. In the dream, they were not waiting for him to join, they were waiting for him to finish something they had already begun. The hum now came not just from the lake, but from every barrel, trough, and basin of standing water. Some nights it seemed to move through the rain itself, turning each drop into a note in the endless steady rhythm. The circle was no longer bound to a location. It was bound to the presence of water. And in the floodplain, that meant it could be anywhere, at any time, in any home. By the end of June, the grandson stopped marking the maps. The circle was no longer measurable. It had become the land itself, hidden in the wells, coiled in the streams threaded through the soil. All that remained was for it to rise again, and when it did, it would not just take the willing. It would take whatever was left. By late summer of 1927, the taking began in earnest. It no longer waited for night or fog or the privacy of an empty road. People vanished in broad daylight, in the middle of conversation, in plain view of their neighbors. One moment they were there, the next they were stepping toward the nearest puddle, barrel, or stream with the same slow, deliberate gait that had haunted the town for years. Sometimes the water wasn't even deep enough to swallow them whole. Yet they were gone all the same, as if their bodies had simply passed through the surface into something deeper than the world allowed. The sheriff's grandson kept his shutters closed, but he could not shut out the sound. The hum was everywhere now, vibrating through the walls, bleeding into the grain of the wood, humming up through the soles of his boots when he stood still too long. At night it grew so loud his teeth ached, his heartbeat matching its rhythm no matter how he tried to resist. Sleep came in broken fragments and always with the same dreams. Standing inside the ring, the figures in white shifting slightly, making space for him. One blistering August afternoon, the river itself turned still. Barges drifted to a halt. Fishermen pulled in their lines, staring at the water's unmoving surface. Then, without warning, the center of the river sank. Not from current, but as though the water was being drawn downward into a hollow. From that pit rose a shape too large to be a person, yet unmistakably human in outline, its surface pale and slick, its proportions wrong. It did not climb or walk onto the shore, it only stood in the water, arms crossed over its chest. The faint burn of the ring visible across its torso like a brand. The hum swelled so violently the air seemed to vibrate. Every bird in the floodplain rose at once and fled inland. By the time the grandson dared to look again, the figure was gone. The river moved as if nothing had happened, but the hum did not fade. It had grown more complex, layered with an undercurrent he had never heard before, something closer to speech, and though he could not understand the words, he knew their meaning. The circle had finished searching. It had gathered what it needed. And now, whatever had been locked beneath St. Augustine's in 1843 was no longer bound to the pit, the lake, or the river. It had taken the shape it needed to move freely. The land, the water, and the people were only the beginning. By autumn of 1927, the land itself began to change. Low places in the fields that had always been dry now held pools of black, motionless water, no matter the weather. The wells in town grew deeper overnight, their stone walls slick with salt. Livestock were found in the mornings lying in perfect spirals, their bodies unmarked, their eyes clouded, pale. The hum no longer rose and fell, and it was constant now, like the slow grinding of something vast turning just beneath the surface of the earth. The sheriff's grandson, worn thin and gaunt, kept to the upstairs rooms of his house, only venturing out to check the lake. What he saw in October made him wish he hadn't. The water had lowered not from drought, but as if something beneath was drawing it down. The lake bed was visible in places. Smooth, dark silt carved with enormous concentric rings. At the center stood the small, pale figure in the white shift, just as it had in his dreams for years, motionless but somehow aware of him. It did not wave, did not beckon, but the hum deepened when he looked at it, pressing into his chest until his breath faltered. That night the remaining townsfolk gathered without speaking, drawn into the streets by some invisible summons. They formed a perfect circle in the square, each standing at exact intervals from the next, their arms crossed, their heads bowed. At the center of the formation lay a wooden disc larger than a cartwheel, its burned ring glowing faintly in the dark. The grandson watched from his window as the disc began to sink into the ground, slowly, without disturbing the dirt, as though the earth was swallowing it whole. When it vanished completely, the hum stopped. The silence lasted only seconds. Then came a sound deeper than anything before, not the low drone they had lived with for years, but something alive, layered, and impossibly vast. The building shuddered. The lake swelled back to its full height in a single smooth surge, and from its surface, The pale figure was gone. The next morning, the streets were empty. Doors hung open, meals sat half-eaten on tables. The sheriff's grandson was alone, yet he could feel he was not truly alone at all. The hum was inside him now, steady and sure like a second heartbeat that would never stop. The circle had moved on, but it had left something behind in him, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it would call him to join it. By the winter of 1928, the sheriff's grandson no longer kept count of the days. Seasons blurred in the constant weight of the hum inside his chest. Sometimes it was faint, like a memory, and other times it swelled so loud he could barely think. The town around him had rotted into silence, the buildings sagging, streets overgrown, wells brimming with black, stagnant water. No birds came here anymore. No insects hummed in the grass. Only the hum remained. He avoided the lake for months, but in February he felt the pull again, a pressure behind his ribs urging his steps. When he reached the bluff, the sight froze him where he stood. The lake was gone. In its place was a vast circular hollow, smooth as glass, its silt floor carved in perfect concentric rings. At the center was a hole, narrow, impossibly deep, the edges lined with salt-white residue. The hum was coming from inside, it now so strong it rattled his teeth. As he stood there, the air shifted. Shapes began to emerge from the rim of the hollow. Not walking, but rising, as though the earth itself was lifting them up. They were human only in outline, pale as bone, their arms crossed over their chests, their heads bowed. There were dozens, then hundreds, all facing inward toward the hole. And in the center, something began to rise from the depths. Not the small figure he had seen before, but something larger, its form shifting like water, its face blank and endless. The hum sharpened into something almost like words, though they were too old for him to understand. He knew their meaning anyway. It was not calling him to witness. It was calling him to join. The circle was complete again, but it would not remain here. It would move as it always had, following the rivers, the lakes, the hidden veins of water beneath the earth, widening until there was nowhere left untouched. He felt his feet sink into the soft silt. The figures turned toward him, their heads lifting in unison. And as the hum filled him entirely, erasing the last thought that was truly his, he understood what his grandfather had feared all along. Once the center is filled, the circle never stops. The lake never returned. In its place, the hollow remained, untouched by rain or growth, its perfect ring still visible from the bluff. People passing through the region gave it wide berth. They did not know the story. They did not need to. On still nights, if they camped too close, they would wake to the faint sound of a low, tuneless melody. One that seemed to come not from the air but from the ground itself, carrying far beyond the empty town. And somewhere far downstream, in another quiet settlement along another riverbank, the hum was beginning again. What do you think? Could this happen again?